All right, we'll get started. Would like to welcome everybody to this year's National Beef Cattle Evaluation Consortium Brown Bagger Series. This is a series put on through the consortium. Basically, in recent years, the primary effort of the consortium. So would like to welcome you all and to this session. And I would imagine most of you have been on to some of the previous ones and know this is an effort that's kind of run by myself, Bob Weber at K-State, and Matt Spangler at Nebraska. And so we'll go through it. You're welcome to join our website. Not a whole lot of new information on there, other than we do continue to house the Brown Bagger series on here. So if you ever missed one or want to go back and see some previous ones, those should be on there. If you have any issues with the website, please let us know, and we'll try and get it corrected as soon as we can. My name's Darrh Bullock. I'm at the University of Kentucky, and been involved with the consortium pretty much since the beginning of it. And this program, I think, Matt, we're in about our 16th year. We've been doing this for quite some time now, and due to the popularity, we will continue to do it as long as you guys see some value in it and would like us to continue. So today we're going to cover one major topic and then just give you a brief update on the Beef Improvement Federation meeting coming up for next year. So I'll just get right into it. Today's session is going to be Dr. Matt Spangler from Nebraska, and he's going to be going over Index 101 and beyond, which I guess, Matt, must mean that you're kind of combining 101 and 102 together and giving them the full spiel. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing Matt. Most of you know Matt. He's very involved in many things, BIF and also with the consortium and the eBEEF.org group, and so we appreciate Matt being willing to cover this topic for us. We could have gone outside, but to be quite honest, the two experts on indexes that in the country are Weber and Spangler, and so we felt it was appropriate to have one of these guys, and Matt stepped up to take care of that for us. So Matt, I am going to turn it over to you. I'm going to stop sharing and let's see how this thing works. There you go.
All right, Darrh. Hopefully you see my PowerPoint slides.
Yep, perfect.
All right, great. Well, thanks for that kind introduction, Darrh. And I was perusing through the list of attendees, and I'll just start with a disclaimer. I see one or two other people on the list of attendees that have done considerable more work in the arena of indexes, Scott Newman, than I have. So look forward to some questions in the chat box before I'm done. So I wanted to just kind of cover what I consider to be the nuts and bolts of index-based selection and construction, and then just briefly highlight some recent efforts that might change the way we utilize index-based selection in the beef industry. And if someone else is on the phone, if they might mute as I go through this. But I wanted to start with a quote I really like from famous animal breeder Rick Borden. In talking about indexes, he said, "There's no easily accessible, objective way for breeders, particularly breeders in the beef and sheep industries where ownership is diverse and production environments vary a great deal, to use these predictions intelligently." And he was really talking about EPDs and the fact that although those are very useful tools, the reality is it can become very complex and cumbersome to try to utilize the plethora of genetic predictions in a meaningful manner. And one way, of course, to alleviate that confusion is through multiple trait selection using indexes. But how to begin? I really think it fundamentally starts with identifying breeding and marketing goals. So admittedly, I absolutely hate vision statements. But you can think of a breeding or marketing goal as a useful vision statement for a commercial enterprise. So really what are the traits that impact profitability of your enterprise, conditioned on your choice to retain heifers or not, your marketing endpoints, and the environment, including availability of labor in which you operate. So let's think about the concept of economically relevant traits as we try to put together a breeding objective. It's really a list of traits that are directly associated with either a revenue stream or a cost. And Bruce Golden and others did a really nice job of summarizing this in the BIF proceeding paper more than a few years ago now. But if you think about a few simple examples, birth weight versus calving ease, obviously birth weight a very valuable indicator, but the thing that actually can manifest in a source of cost is calving difficulty. So calving ease becomes the ERT. Ribeye area, again, a component of yield grade if we look at the second example, but yield grade is the thing that has premiums or probably more pointedly discounts associated with it. Yearling weight versus carcass weight, that's an interesting one. So at an enterprise level, it very well may depend on what the end point is that you market at. Do you market at yearling, or do you market animals based on carcass weight? From a beef industry complex perspective, there's no doubt the ERT is carcass weight. And so there are examples, given the lack of integration in our industry, where the ERT at an enterprise level differs from that at an entire beef system level. Mature cow weight versus dry matter intake. Well, mature weight definitely is a sale weight and a potential source of revenue, but it's also an indicator of cost related to how much a female may actually eat. So her actual intake becomes the ERT. And then perhaps one of my favorite examples at the end here, residual feed intake versus actual feed intake. The ERT is feed intake, right? It's related to how much an animal actually ate, which in terms of a cost, that is what the cost is. Residual feed intake is an index itself, a special kind of index that we call a desired gains index. And more specifically than that, it's a restricted index. So we condition out one variable and say we want to change something else whilst holding one variable constant. And so it's a special kind of index, but I would contend itself is not an economically relevant trait. So some of those I mentioned are indicator traits, or things that are genetically correlated to something that has a direct cost or revenue associated with it, but itself does not. And you may ask, well, why do we even care about indicator traits? Because if they're measured earlier in life, or if they're cheaper or easier to measure, or if it's something that we can measure on both sexes to begin to predict a sex-limited trait, then they become very useful, right? So it's related to how early in life we can get a measurement and begin to predict. Or if you think about carcass versus ultrasound, there's no doubt carcass traits are the ERT. We want more carcass traits. But we can't get those on breeding animals, so we use a non-destructive means ultrasound, which is the indicator. So there are multiple methods of multiple trait selection, a little bit of alliteration there. One is tandem selection. So that basically says if I want to improve both birth weight and yearling weight, an example, I'm going to select for a period of time, press birth weight down until I get it at a level I want. Then I'm going to forget about it, and I'm going to start selecting to increase yearling weight. The problem with that is it's very inefficient, particularly if the traits are antagonistically related. And so as a consequence, if I were to actually do that, I could erode all the progress that I made in birth weight once I begin selecting for the second trait. The second thing is using independent culling levels, which is probably more pervasive in the beef industry than I would like to admit. That's where we set these independent levels for each trait, and we only consider a sire if he meets or exceeds our threshold for all traits. And in practice, probably what happens is we cheat on what those independent culling levels are because we really like a bull or we really dislike it. The problem is, if you think about it in an economic framework, it's possible that a bull just barely missed our threshold for one trait, but vastly exceeded it for another trait, and as a consequence, in terms of his aggregate merit, he is actually the best choice. And that's really what selection indices allow us to do. So a selection index, again, it's really selection on aggregate merit, and it's not a new concept if you look at the date here by any stretch of the imagination. And originally really thought of as a list of traits that influence satisfaction, and we've come to interpret satisfaction as the ability to increase net profit. So the relative economic value for each trait essentially becomes the weighting then for the genetic prediction for each trait. So in a nutshell, it's something that we can use to select for multiple traits simultaneously, but it's really conditional on our breeding objectives, the economic parameters, so that might influence the relative economic weighting of each one of those traits, the relationship among traits, and then if we want to be more specific, the population or herd mean. So an example, if 100% of my heifers get pregnant every year, the economic importance of me continuing to increase heifer pregnancy is a lot different as compared to somebody who has a lot of reproductive failure. The important take home here is that these tools are designed to improve commercial level profitability. So the relative economic weightings are designed to help increase net profit at the commercial level. And that's something that's really important to understand. And as a consequence, these tools cannot be confused with breed or organization specified trait goals. So those are really two different things. And those of you that have worked with or in other industries know that these tools are relatively old hat in the swine and poultry breeding industries, but really only formally released by breed associations in the U.S. In the last decade. So what impacts selection indices? Well, change to the goal trait. So if all of a sudden there's a new trait that I identify in the breeding objective that's a driver of profit, that'll undoubtedly change the index. Changes to traits that have EPD. As new EPD become available, those will certainly change the index values. And any changes to the relationships among traits or the accuracy actually of the EPDs that go into the indices. I'd also mention that changes in our economic parameters or economic assumptions can change index values as well. And we'll get into a little bit more about how those relative economic values can be derived, but I would say in general, indices, if done correctly, can be relatively robust across those minor changes in economic values. So this is the general form of an index. I'm sure a lot of you recognize this. So B is the index weight that goes along with EPDs. This P inverse is a phenotypic variance covariance matrix among the selection traits, the things that actually might go into the index. G is a genetic variance covariance matrix between the things that might go in the index and the things that we really wish to change in our goal. And then V becomes V is the economic values associated with the traits. So this is a form that most people have probably seen before. The V values can really come about in a couple of different ways. One is kind of a partial budgeting approach. Another is through simulation using what we call a stochastic model. And so you can think about simulating a group of animals or a herd and simulating a bunch of animals there. And if we have multiple traits, we'd say, what happens if we change one trait by 1 unit, hold everything else constant, and then contrast the profit difference from having made that 1 unit change in one trait to what the base level was. And really that then becomes the root of these economic values. Oftentimes to get the values of feedstuffs or the revenue based on certain carcass premiums or carcass weights, we can use rolling averages. So you might think about it as 5-year averages of industry values for those. And because we're able to really take averages over a longer time horizon, that's what helps makes these assumptions a bit more robust. Now, if we apply these index weights to EPDs, no longer are we interested in the phenotypic variance covariance matrix among our selection traits. We're interested in the genetic variance covariance matrix, and that's what I have here is G11 inverse. And so a slight change in terms of the variances and covariances that we use as we move from an index that would take into account phenotypes versus one that would take into account EPDs. And yet another change is, what if every single trait that we have listed as a goal that's in our breeding objective also has a corresponding EPD? In that case, the algebra becomes much simpler, and the economic weights then associated with it, or the weightings associated with the EPD, are directly the economic values. So those middle matrices come out because they're actually the same thing. And I would contend, although this is the desired case, right, we have an EPD for every trait that is a driver of profit for a given production scenario. Although that's the ideal case, I would contend it's rarely the case. And if it is, that often points to the fact that perhaps our breeding objective, our list of goal traits, was actually incomplete. And this is an example. So if we think about a completely terminal-based production system, things that might be profit drivers here on the left-hand side, like hot carcass weight, yield grade, quality grade, feed intake, yardage, which is related to days on feed, mortality and morbidity, the things that we potentially have EPDs for would be carcass weight, the components of yield grade, marbling, dry matter intake, maybe days to finish or age to finish. But I'm unaware of anything in the U.S. beef cattle industry that directly points towards mortality and morbidity. Now, if we leave these two things off of our list of goal traits, then we make the assumption perhaps that we actually have an EPD for every economically relevant trait. And that would be my situation where I say, actually, our breeding objective maybe wasn't as complete as it should have been. So to that end, I see a tremendous value in being able to get some of those really important economically relevant traits that are collected every day in our commercial industry into genetic evaluations. And I just have a listing of a few here, but you could probably imagine more. These are things that are collected, but never matriculate to a breed association or genetic service provider. And I think not only would enable additional EPDs, but would dramatically improve the current selection indices. So of course, an example of how an index might work, let's say this is in profitability per exposure. We have two index values. These two bulls differ by 24. Is that right? Yeah, 24. And now I'm worried that my arithmetic here is wrong. But if we take the assumption that these bulls would cover about 30 cows a year over a 4-year time horizon, that's actually 120 exposures in their entire lifetime. And if we take the number of exposures then times the difference in their index value, yeah, that's right, we end up with about a $3,000 difference. And so that says that if we follow the assumptions of this fictitious index, that Bull A actually should generate close to $3,000 more in net profit than Bull B. How do we increase that value? Well, if I can get Bull A to cover more cows than 120 a year, perhaps by artificial insemination, then all of a sudden I can dramatically increase the potential profit difference. And so that's an interesting thought, is actually selecting bulls and buying bulls based on the economic benefit to your operation. And it requires a little bit of this very simple math. So if Darrh Bullock has 5 cows and I have 500 cows, and I'm willing to buy a bull, collect him, AI him to a bunch of cows, and then also turn him out natural service, I can afford to pay more for that bull than Darrh can. So I think that's important when we actually choose bulls in an economic framework. This isn't a completely exhaustive list of all indexes in the beef industry. I know Shorthorn has some, and maybe a couple of other breeds, but this is fairly close. And what I've done is listed them as either terminal or maternal. And somebody on the line's probably itching to correct me and say that none of these are maternal indices, and I would agree. At best, they're what we'd call general purpose indices, designed for somebody that is retaining replacement females, but also has terminal animals that they're marketing. And I might be even a bit more critical and say that some of these aren't even really general purpose. They're really sub-indices or a component of a general purpose index, but probably don't get at the complete breeding objective because they don't contemplate the full value of sale calves. They maybe don't have a component of fertility, things of that nature. However, the point of this is, let's pick on Angus's dollar beef, which is arguably the most popular index in the U.S. beef cattle industry, and it's a fantastic terminal index, right? It contemplates carcass merit, carcass weight, feed intake, etc. And so if your breeding goal says every single calf born, I'm going to retain ownership through the feed yard and sell towards a certified Angus beef grid, it is a good index to use. However, if your breeding objective as a commercial producer includes retaining replacement females, then you need to be aware you're retaining replacement females after having selected for nothing related to reproductive success, and on an index that heavily weights carcass weight, which likely means you're going to have a correlated response and increased cow weight. So indexes are a great tool, but like any tool, they can be misused if you don't understand them. Maybe just a couple of quick comments on accuracy of indices. There'll be a test afterwards, so everyone pay attention to this slide. The numerator, of course, is a covariance between really our index and our aggregate genotype, or that kind of more complete breeding objective. In the denominator, then, we have the variance of the index and the variance of the aggregate genotype. So what impacts the accuracy of an index? Well, the accuracy of the component trait EPD impacts this, how well we've estimated the relationships among traits, and how well we've actually been able to estimate the relative economic value. So you may think of something that's heavily weighted in an index, the relative economic value is really high, but if across the breeder population we really don't have any information for that trait, then what happens is the EPDs become heavily regressed towards the population mean, so they don't vary among animals. And if the EPD doesn't vary, then even though the trait is supposed to be heavily weighted in the index, it's really not going to have any influence. And so a simple example here, if we have two EPDs, one has a weighting of 0.9, the other a weighting of 0.1. If all the animals in the population have the same EPD for trait 1, then really trait 1 isn't going to influence the index because there's no variation between animals there. As the accuracy, though, might increase and EPDs become more dispersed, then we'll see it have a larger influence actually in the index ranking. I'd also just make a quick comment that changes in trait definitions over time can impact these indices. So as breed organizations make changes to their national cattle evaluation or genetic evaluation, they should think about, did I actually change the scaling or the definition of the trait? And if so, then it merits going back and taking another look at the economic values associated with those traits because they may need to be changed as well. You know, we've heard a lot about breeds that have crossed the finish line relative to single-step genetic evaluation, single-step inclusion of genomic information, and rightfully so as a beef industry, we should pat ourselves on the back for that. And although there's going to be continual changes in the way we actually utilize genomic information, I do think now is the time to sit back and really think about improving the way decisions are made. And it has become clear to me that economic indices are misunderstood, and hopefully I didn't make that problem worse today. But I would contend that organizations need to now focus on really not only improving the density of phenotypes collected, but also looking at garnering more phenotypes that clearly have an economic value downstream. So the challenge is data is continually growing, and we need to turn that data into tools, turn it into knowledge, and we do that fairly well with EPDs. But as we increase the list of EPDs, I think we need to help beef cattle producers actually make decisions with those tools. I think it's on the verge of unreasonable to continually adding new EPDs to the list and not providing tools to actually help use, as Rick Borden said, those predictions intelligently. So that brings me to a recent effort. The folks at Clay Center, Mark Thalman, Warren Snelling, Larry Keene, Bruce Golden at Theta Solutions, Bob Weber at Kansas State, and myself recently were awarded a USDA grant to develop what we call web-based decision support. So the fundamental idea behind it is that beef cattle producers can actually make use of herd level parameters. So you can think about it as average weight of calves weaned or calves sold, the costing of feed, Hey, let me try there. Hi guys, Matt's back, and hopefully you can hear me. Darrh had said that you lost audio some time ago, and I'm assuming that's what all the chat questions are about, so hopefully you can hear me now. I apologize for whatever happened there. So I don't know where you lost me, but I'll just kind of summarize what a group of us are working on. So just to reiterate, it's a group including Larry Keene, Mark Thalman, Warren Snelling, Bruce Golden, and Bob Weber, to develop what we call web-based decision support, whereby Well, for those who are still with us, I really apologize about this, but I think the issue is actually Darrh can't hear any of us, and so he thought that I had lost audio. So if you can hear me, if you'd kindly type into the chat box, I guess, so that we know that you can hear me now. But so the third time, the idea behind decision support is we can actually customize indices towards a particular enterprise's breeding objectives and apply those customized weights to either a group of individuals on sale that a particular producer has interest in. They could be applied to an entire population. You can think about it as an entire organization's database, to where the decisions based on animals to buy can be based on a net profit that is using parameters defined by a particular buyer or seller. And so if we think about potential people that could use this in kind of a use case format, you can think about a commercial bull buyer that may wish to rank animals based on their customizable index. It could be a seed stock seller that wishes to place animals on offer based on a customized index, or a seed stock buyer that says, given what my goals are as a seed stock producer, I wish to differentially rank animals. And so all these three uses have different needs and different objectives, but all can refine their decision-making process using such a tool. And I guess myself and the group believe that another benefit of this is really creating a more intimate kind of engagement with bull buyers and genetic selection tools like indices, because they're actually taking part in the process of creating them. Now, this in no way says that the indices that we have to date aren't useful. They most certainly are useful. What we're proposing is that we can refine those indices and also perhaps increase the rate of technology adoption for tools such as these. So with that, again, apologize for the technical difficulties here, but I do want to point you to a few helpful websites. Of course, you're familiar with NBCEC.org, but I also want to point you towards eBEEF.org that has a lot of educational material about beef cattle genetics meant for producers and extension personnel. And I'd also like to put a plug in for the BIF Genetic Prediction Workshop that's coming up in December in Kansas City. And there'll be a couple of talks there centered more on economic selection indices. And I'll go into more detail about the grant we have to develop web-based decision support. So with that, Darrh, if there are questions in the chat box not related to being able to hear me, I'd be happy to handle those now. And if not, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Sorry, everybody. I guess the problem was on my end, but I guess when I stopped hearing Matt, I assumed that he wasn't going out to you guys. So that was my fault on all that. So let me see. Have a couple of questions, Matt. The first one from Justin Buchanan: should sensory or consumer evaluation traits be a part of a breeding objective, even though it is not always clear who gets paid for those traits?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Justin. We can think about things like tenderness, healthfulness of beef traits, all those kinds of things. The challenge becomes in assigning an economic value to them. And you could contend, even if there's not a marketing scheme where there's direct value paid, there is value in their improvement because it increases consumer satisfaction with beef, which then matriculates down to all beef cattle producers. But somehow that has to be captured. And if you don't capture that, then any weighting you apply to them is essentially ad hoc. So to me, it centers on being able to capture either direct or indirect economic value.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Scott Newman says, great presentation, Matthew. I have a couple of questions if there's time. One, can you comment on the difference between breed goals and producer goals? First, I'll let you answer that first.
Yeah, so the way I think about it, Scott, is that a commercial producer's goal should be to to really increase profit conditioned on the way they market calves, etc. Breed goals may be related to maintaining a short-term or long-term competitive advantage. So a nice example, and I'm using these examples, not meaning to throw breeds under the bus, but take something like Limousine, who at one time had a reputation for docility issues. They created an EPD for it. They made changes. That was a breed direction plan to correct an issue that created a competitive disadvantage in the marketplace. But that does not necessarily mean that that trait would have received heavy weighting in a commercial profit-based index. And so that's kind of how I view it, Scott. So there may be nucleus breeders in a breed that choose a desired gains approach to simply maintain competitive advantage.
Okay. His second question is, what are your thoughts on the use of desired gains for index customization?
Yeah. So, I remember a phone call with two pretty sharp people about this not too long ago. So I could see logic in a seed stock producer, hopefully a true nucleus breeder, wishing to use a desired gains approach. I struggle with the logic in a commercial level producer using a desired gains approach, because inherently that could mean selection that's not optimized for profit. So I really think it depends on where somebody sits in the breeding pyramid as to whether or not that's reasonable. That's something that could be up for debate, but that's the way I think about it.
Okay, waiting on anybody else that wants to type in a question. If you guys see there's an opportunity down there to type in the question and answer part. If you put one in, I'll relate that to Matt. But during the meantime, Matt, I have one for you, and we've had this discussion a good bit. And the thing I get hung up on and frustrated with, I guess, with indexes is and you may have covered this when I was off, but is the fact that everything is linear, and we know that that's not how those traits affect economics. And I'm thinking about, in particular, like calving ease direct, and we've discussed this before, the plateau effect of that. And even maybe more concerning is a trait like milking ability. When we put cattle in an environment to where we put so much of a strain on them through their milking ability that we start seeing a negative impact on reproduction, although the more milk we keep putting into them, the higher that index tends to climb. So any thoughts on that?
So I think it's more challenging, not necessarily impossible, but more challenging in a static index that's meant for the masses to truly take into account those differences. And one part of it is because you have an assumption about what a population mean is. And when you perturb that by one unit, you're making a linear assumption. If you were to customize that, whereby you're assigning economic values dependent on an enterprise's herd mean, I think that becomes a little bit easier to accommodate. The other comment I would make is that despite those things, I think we have to ask ourselves, do the indices point us in a vastly incorrect direction? And I don't believe that they do. Could the differences between individuals change some? Yeah, I think so. Would there be complete re-ranking? No, I don't think there would be.
Okay. I'm not getting any more questions now, and I think that you would, if anyone thinks of questions or whatever else, would be happy to take any emails, or if somebody wants to contact you about any of this. I know in the past you guys have always been accepting of that, and I assume that's the case.
Yep, that's right. People can shoot me an email if anything was unclear, or if they have questions or comments. Okay.
I really do appreciate it, Matt. Nice job. And just to carry on, we have a little bit more information for you guys, and I hope my information is up there. Just wanted to go over real quick and give you guys an invitation to the next year's BIF. It will be hosted by the group at South Dakota, and it's going to be held in Brookings this next year in 2019. The dates, go ahead and lock in. The dates are June 18th through the 21st. And that takes us from the opening session all the way through to the tours. The program committee, that we don't have a program out for you yet. That gets decided. It's a little later this year than usual, but we moved our mid-year BIF meeting to December to correspond with the genetic prediction workshop. And so that's going to be a little bit later than maybe some years past, but we're going to be working on the program in December. So I'm guessing that by early to mid-January, that information will be available. To keep updated on the most recent, what's going on with next year's convention and symposium, please go to the BIF website, which is www.beefimprovement.org, and that will take you in there to the website. And as information gets updated, eventually we will have all the hotel information up, registration information up, as well as the finalized schedule as it becomes available. Would like to thank you guys. This is the last session for this year of the brown bagger, and so we appreciate that. And you know that you can go to if you wanted to see, if you missed any of the recordings or missed any of the sessions and want to go back to the recordings, that's available on the NBCEC website. Under the professionals portion, there is a section for the brown baggers that's available for you guys. And we always welcome you guys to use any of this information how you see fit. If you get information from this, we would love to be credited for it, but use the information, please. That's the purpose of these brown baggers, is to give you guys information that you can go out and utilize in your educational program. So please do that. Bob will be getting an evaluation out to you guys shortly to kind of let us know what you like or didn't like, or where you would like us pointed in the future. I promise you, every year when the three of us sit down and start making our plans for the next year, we review all of those and see what your suggestions are and try and accommodate wherever we can. We'll point out we do like to keep these brown baggers on the genetics end, so if you give us suggestions in other areas, it hits a little bit of deaf ears in that regard. But anything to do with genetics, we're happy to try and accommodate when at all possible. So please give us your feedback in that regard. I'm going to make a plug again, as Matt did. You know, we have some information still up on the NBCEC website, and particularly these brown bagger sessions. Please go to those. But we're transitioning a lot of our educational material that has to do with beef cattle genetics over to the eBEEF website. And so if you haven't been there, I encourage you to join up, sign up for the newsletter if you would, and we try and get information updated there as current as we possibly can. And it's a great resource for your clientele as well to point them in that direction. So with that said, we do appreciate everybody joining you. Matt, do you have any last thoughts that you wanted to share, or all good on your end?
Nope, we're good there.
All right, everybody. We sure do appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you guys at BIF or the Genetic Prediction Workshop or other venues between now and then. And everybody take care, and we'll be in touch. So long.